Hello. Welcome to the second session of our interesting workshop. At least until now, I think it's very interesting, and I'm sure that the next two presentations will add to this. So we have, as I said, two presentations, one by Frederick Guy and one by Neil Lee. We start with Frederick on regional income disparities and how they come about. And he, together with Simona, Iammarino, and Maryann Feldman, look at the specific impact of monopolies, agglomeration, and the role of and power of financial firms. So, Frederick, floor is yours. Looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much. Now, let's see. I'm not seeing do you see my slides?
Not yet. You
have share. Okay, because I shared before. Let's share again. Okay.
Looks good.
There we go. There we go. All right. I really liked the two previous papers, and I hope I can provide something that at least complements what they're doing, because our approach here is quite a bit different. I mean, we are. Both of the previous papers were looking at increase or changes in inequality, both interpersonal and spatial, as an outcome of technological change and technological development. What we're looking at is power relationships, institutional factors, which are correlated with technological development. That is, companies that we often think of, we probably even describe them in our paper as tech companies, also exercise a considerable degree of monopoly power, and there are then relationships between them and the financial sector, between both the monopolistic companies and the financial sector and the government, and all of these configurations have spatial implications and implications for income inequality. So let's. This is a nice thing to think about as we come up to the U.S. presidential election next week. I should say next week. Half of it has already happened, right? Half the votes have already been cast. Reflecting on the results of the presidential election 4 years ago, the candidate who lost lamented that she had won the places that were optimistic, diverse, dynamic, moving forward, and which produced 2/3 of the United States gross domestic product. And she doesn't she says Trump's whole campaign was looking backwards. She doesn't say the places were looking backward, but one could perhaps read this information in. This is, I'll show you the maps first, because the maps are pretty. What we've done here, using commuting zones in the United States and scaling them by population, so the map gets a bit distorted, is plotted this is for 1980, the share of employed people who have incomes in the top 20% of the national distribution. So you would expect this typically, obviously, to be a share of 0.2, and some are higher and some are lower. And you can see that as recently as 1980, some of the places that were doing the best by this measure were old industrial areas in the Midwest, in particular Detroit, Michigan, large city there, top center, and that dark green sliver to the right of Chicago, Illinois, is I think the steel making center of Gary, Indiana. San Francisco, San Jose, Seattle, not doing badly. Seattle at this point actually was a very successful old economy city with Boeing and plywood manufacturing and heavily unionized section of dock workers. And Washington, D.C. doing very well by this measure. If we move forward to 2016, that year in which Donald Trump was elected, we see that those places in the Midwest are not doing nearly as well. San Francisco, San Jose, Seattle are doing fabulously, as are New York and Washington, D.C., Boston. This becomes even more vivid if we look at this as a change in this measure from 1980 to 2016. And you can see why these places, because this doesn't deviate terribly far from the electoral map of that year, why those places that were voting for Hillary were also optimistic, diverse. Well, why they were, diversity is another question, but why they were optimistic and felt they were moving forward. What they were is major tech clusters or finance clusters or the center of the federal government, Washington, D.C. I want to select here on a few of the influences that bring us to this, or just perhaps not so. I mean, there are too many influences to count, but just to frame it with a couple of other arguments that are out there about this rise in inequality. One that does not have an explicit geographical element, but our inspiration for taking the top 20% to map is this argument by Richard Reeves, which sees a sort of a technologically determined narrowing of opportunities, and then a fortification of the ladders of opportunity by the people in the top 20% to make sure their kids get into the right networks, the right schools, and so on, keeping everybody else out. But Reeves, like so many, is taking the technological basis of this narrowing of opportunity as given. A good example of that same kind of argument applied to places in Moretti's book back in 2012, and he makes a very nice comparison. At the start of that book, you don't even have to read the whole book to get this nice story. A contrast between the city of Menlo Park, which is located between San Francisco and San Jose, right heart of the Silicon Valley, right next to Stanford University. Menlo Park, I guess, is now the home of Facebook. And down in the Central Valley, California, agrarian area, and he's telling a story of some engineer who in 1972 moved from Menlo Park to Visalia, which at that time was just moving between two places that were not so different, and which today is moving from extreme wealth to poverty. Why? And he tells a story that we would all be familiar with about a combination of skill-biased technological change and agglomeration economies. And that's why, you know, this area, the the Silicon Valley, the San Francisco, San Jose area has grown so astonishingly wealthy in comparison, especially to these other places that are not even so far away. But we want to bring into this monopoly. Now, this is the sort of emerging, and you notice the House of Representatives just concluded hearings on this, grilling the heads of big tech companies. But it's not just the big tech companies we're talking about. This is the dirty secret of deregulation and liberalization starting circa 1980, is that these policies that were brought in almost entirely on a platform of promoting market competition, with market competition as the be-all and end-all of social solutions, has been followed by, whether it led to it or not, let's just say it has been followed by, in the United States, an astonishing rise in market power. This particular plotting of it, which is an estimation of markups across all industries in the United States on average, comes from a paper by Egerton et al., but there's now a big literature on this. And this is not, however, uniform across. This is biggest, in fact, in because the sectors in what we can call we got platform business models which are, what is a platform? A platform is that you've got some section of services on the web to which you manage to set yourself up as a monopoly gatekeeper. And this gives us business models which can have markets which are geographically universal. You can have a little office in San Francisco and be controlling the of flats, the holiday, Airbnb, whatever, and yet the employment, the control are astonishingly concentrated spatially. And we want also to bring into this finance, because somebody finances the growth of these monopolies. And it's well understood that many of these companies, although they exercise a great deal of power, can go for years without money. They need to finance thousands of others who want to emulate this behavior, and they want to grow, and they're prospective monopolies, they're startups. And this is what startup is, essentially, is a synonym for prospective monopoly. If I open a little pizzeria or a car repair shop, it's not a startup. Nobody would call it a startup, except ironically, unless I have designed it as a model that can be franchised and spread all around the country. But the other side of that finance story is that money comes from somewhere. A lot of it is being squeezed out of other firms which make less attractive investments because they happen to be in markets which are actually more competitive. And that doesn't happen by itself. Somebody does it. The financial actors do that work. So we want to put these pieces together, elimination, monopoly, and finance, to try to explain this rise in inequality spatially. When we think of agglomeration economies, thinking of increasing returns to place, that is, it's something external to firms. And all of our stories about clusters, about industrial districts, usually start with this appeal to these very benign Marshallian forces. You have specialized labor, you have knowledge spillovers, you have value chain proximity. It may be very specialized in the localization sense, it may be you're benefiting from diversity, but in any case, it's external to the firm. The firm pays a price for locating there, it's more expensive, and gets these benefits. It does not necessarily make the firm any more profitable, but it makes all of the labor there more productive. And this, you know, we can complicate a bit with spatial unbundling of processes with global value chains and sort of the shedding of lower skilled or less sensitive jobs to other places. If this is what's going on, how do you fix spatial inequality when it's due to increasing returns to place? You know, we all know many people who are in the business many of us are in the business of advising people about how to do this or teaching people about how to do this, and the usual prescription is essentially to make your place better. Some sort of smart specialization, reform of your institutions, investing in innovation and entrepreneurship, attracting foreign capital, whatever you're doing, okay? And what we're saying here essentially is that this probably won't work because monopoly makes these rich agglomerations into fortresses. Of course, the other piece of advice that we know some economic geographers give is simply, well, forget it, move to the big city. You're not very productive anywhere else. Okay, so obviously the difference between that agglomeration story and monopoly is that with monopoly we're talking about increasing returns which are internal to firms. I'll skip here the various institutional changes which have made this more prevalent in the United States than it was 40 years ago. I mean, some of it's legal, and we can thank the oh God, the sorts who are now completely dominant on the Supreme Court for this. Some of it's the deregulation, some of it's expanded intellectual property rights, and some of it is simply really a failure to come to grips with the kinds of monopoly models that come with the new network industries, the platform industries. Oops, where are we going? But you can see this. I mean, when you begin, I mean, as the congressional hearings we're doing in recent weeks, when you begin to look at these companies, it's astonishing that 84% of global spending on digital advertising goes through Google and Facebook. That Amazon is in a position to both advertise and advertise the services of many thousands of small suppliers in its marketplace, and then capture their data and use it to compete against them. I mean, you couldn't make up that. Around the world, there are how many thousands of people now working on apps for telephones, which will then, or at least which wind up going through exactly 2 app stores, right, on Google's App Store and Apple's App Store, with those companies taking a cut. There are a lot of variants of these platform models, but they create opportunities, really such as I was describing, that you have a relatively small company in terms of number of people employed, that can, from a small number of locations, exercise market power over a very large geographical area. So it's concentrating the good jobs and concentrating the revenues spatially. How does this compare with old network models? I mean, because we've been here before with the economy really dependent on new and hugely productive networks with electric power. You know, you go back 120 years ago, electric power, telephones, railways. Suddenly you had these networks, great internal return, increasing returns. As soon as they are in place, they become indispensable because the advantage to using them is so great compared to not having them. And ways were found to regulate them, either putting them into public ownership or simply heavily regulating the industry. Didn't matter the government, didn't matter the river, one way or another. All of those old networks were either put under public control, either put under public ownership or regulated, because they were indispensable and they were by nature monopolies. Difference between that and the situation we have here is that most of those old networks, most of the power they exercised was coextensive with their actual assets on the ground, and so, you know, you're looking at somebody's electric power network within your state or within your nation state. You know what to take control of. The same, these new ones, we know they're a bit bigger, right? I mean, you know, so how does a small country somewhere regulate Google, regulate Microsoft? We can see this in the market valuation of the companies. Here we're comparing, this is a slightly different basis. It's 1976 and 2016, 1780. In each year, we've taken the top 8 companies by market valuation. And the red circles are 1976. The blue circles are 2016. These are non-financial American-based companies and non-natural resource because the oil companies are so volatile in their valuation. And so we've got market valuation scaled to GDP on the horizontal axis. We've got the number of employees on the vertical axis. The market valuation figure is logged. So I mean, you mentioned what this would look like if it weren't compressed with the logarithms, all right? I mean, so in 2016 have far smaller workforces than the biggest companies in 1976. And with the exception of what had been, I mean, the only companies in 1976 which rivaled them in terms of market valuation were AT&T, which was the telephone monopoly, and IBM, which had at that time basically a monopoly on mainframe computing, and it maintained this monopoly through a software standard, which was, it was providing both the computer and the software. It was a lot easier to copy the computer than to copy the software itself. That rise in market valuation is not matched by a rise in the book value of assets, and we can sort of get a rough and ready estimate of market power by comparing market valuation with the book value of assets. And here we've plotted that, again, by commuting zone across the country, the change in that. And we can see it's not exactly the same pattern as the change in wages, but it is very, very close, right? That it's on the coasts, east and west, that you get the big rise in market valuation, and there in the center of the country, you have not actually a fall in market valuation. This is for companies in the United States generally. Our two core arguments are these. One is that Marshallian externalities in these agglomerations are amplified by market power. That you look at a place like the Silicon Valley, it's the home of a lot of companies that are exercising market power. And this, first of all, raises the marginal product of labor that is important for maintaining or extending their market power, raising the wages. And second, because of the nature of these platforms, I mean, these platforms are companies that have control at some point for getting into a network, like the network involved in Android phone apps or whatever, various different networks. And they need both to defend that point and to extend the use of it, leverage it by getting new uses for that same access portal. So they're surrounded by startups who are creating products that, oh, maybe somebody might dream of turning this product into the next big platform company. But in fact, what they know is that their best hope is first to get some venture capital funding, and then when they've grown a little bit, get taken over, right? So it's to the mutual advantage of the giants and the minnows to be located in the same place, to participate in this model of startup and takeover, all of which feeds into the extension of these monopolies. What harm does this do? In these clusters, you get extreme polarization of income and living standards. Outside the clusters, you have, these places technologically and financially, we would argue, are not simply left behind, but actually held back. The usefulness of software creation and modification skills, programming skills, which is universally taught, gets concentrated in particular firms in particular places. And it gets concentrated there by the barriers which the big companies put up to new competition. And whew, and here, all I want actually is, sorry that the top of this slide is duplicating what was before. I just want the bottom, which is, I mean, we have the familiar cost of monopoly from economics 1, and people will often ask, well, why is it a cost to monopoly if I can get things cheaper on Amazon? Isn't I mean, this is actually what the Supreme Court would ask you. If I can get things cheaper on Amazon, why does that cost me anything? And the answer is that the appropriate counterfactual is not whether you can get it cheaper on Amazon than any place else. It's whether you can get it cheaper with Amazon than you would with a platform that was a similar platform that was managed on a common carrier basis, which is exactly the question that would have been asked of railways 100 years ago. Now,
Frederick, yeah, that would be perfect. Many thanks. Yep.
Okay, let me just say the financial end of this is this. That well, I referred to the financial end of it earlier, so we don't really need to go into that further. I commend you to the paper, and I'll wrap it up at that point. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the very rich presentation. I think it's really interesting to match it later on with the presentation by Olaf Sørensen. I think there might be some interesting overlap. We have some minutes for a brief clarification questions. Are there any questions concerning the content? There were some audio problems sometimes, so maybe there are some questions regarding.
Were there audio problems?
Yes, sometimes it was a little bit hard to understand, but still, I think everybody was able to follow. Because there are no clarification questions, at least right now. I have some questions on content, but we can do this later on as well. Okay. So let me thank you very much. We come back to you later for the discussion. So I would switch to Neil. So we stick to London somehow from the Department of Management at Birkbeck University of London to London School of Economics. And we changed the topic a little bit to inclusive innovation and the peculiar role this plays for regional inequality and some policy implications related to this. So Neil Lee, the floor is yours. Neil is a professor of economic geography at LSE. Looking forward to your presentation.
Great, well, thank you. You can hear me? Great, well, thank you very much for the invitation to present. It's a pleasure as well to follow Frederick's paper, which I think is quite a sort of agenda setting one in a sort of wonderful way. And it's lovely to sort of be presenting in front of such a sort of international audience. I think is great. Now, let me give a bit of introduction about the sort of paper which I'm presenting today, which is that most of my life I spend it churning out econometrics, but once a year I allow myself to do a paper on a sort of policy agenda, something I think is quite interesting. My sort of agenda for this is really that, you know, I used to work for a think tank, so I have a sort of strong practical focus, but also often these are the sort of fun things to write because they sort of help you think about the way in which sort of academic material, the type of thing we're talking about in seminars like this, actually translates into real life. So it's quite a helpful exercise from that perspective. But my wife is a Treasury civil servant here in the UK, and one of the things she often says to me is, well, Neil, it doesn't work like that. She says that to me quite a lot about all sorts of things, but not least the sort of policy process. So this is a piece about a policy agenda, essentially, and it's a policy agenda which we've seen in the global south, which has moved into sort of the global north, as it were. It's been quite a big deal in the US, and also increasingly now in the UK. And essentially, you know, this is a piece about when this policy agenda sort of, you know, the academic work or the nicely defined OECD type work when that hits reality. So when the concept hits reality. But let me motivate it first of all by saying why I think this is an important agenda, certainly in the UK and more broadly. And the reason for that is that there's been a related policy agenda about inclusive growth. So this is the idea that we have inequality is too high, both regional inequality and within regional inequality in the UK, too high. Depending on how you measure it, it has probably been increasing over time, but it is certainly too high. And there's been a concern over the last decade, certainly since the financial crisis, certainly since the last crisis, that the benefits of growth have not been sort of equitably shared. So this inclusive growth agenda has built up. We've seen it across from the sort of OECD, obviously been launching a sort of set of a sort of policy agenda focused on inclusive growth in cities. And we've seen it sort of spread across the sort of, what we probably shouldn't really be calling them advanced economies, but across the sort of advanced economies of the OECD, we've seen this sort of inclusive growth agenda become enormously important. And in the UK, this has been sort of solidified in this notion that actually we should be thinking not just about the policy instruments in terms of how they affect growth, but we should also be doing some thinking about what their sort of distributional consequences are. So I think, drawing a link with Frederick's presentation just now, one of the things we talk about is the idea that the sort of tech economy or innovation may be driving inequality. And the sort of inclusive growth agenda is sort of partly around that. Has been sort of important and sort of, led a little bit to us thinking about the relationships between inclusion and innovation. But then the second thing which has happened has been a big policy agenda in the UK. I don't know if you can work out who this is, and it's probably not familiar to people outside of the UK, but this guy called Dominic Cummings. Now, Dominic Cummings was the evil genius of Brexit. He's the Prime Minister's chief advisor, and he's a guy who's obsessed with technology, and he's obsessed with technology in a sort of Silicon Valley type way. And you can see this in the UK's pretty poor response to the coronavirus pandemic. And there's been lots of people putting faith in the idea that we can somehow do something with technology, and this doing something with technology will somehow sort of rescue us from these sort of problems. And Dominic Cummings, I mean, for me, is the sort of poster boy of this sort of type of thinking. And what we've seen is inclusive growth agenda. We should be thinking more about distribution, increased focus on sort of innovation and new technology. And then we've seen both of these agendas focused in on a sort of city or regional level. And we've seen city governments across the UK, where you can see this, we have examples from right across Europe and the United States of city governments or regional governments trying to link the idea of innovation and inclusion. And in some sense, they have been focused on the idea of innovation or inclusive innovation. And that's what this paper is about, because we invest huge amounts of money on innovation. The UK, huge amounts, and of course less so than in most other advanced economies. But innovation is disruptive. We know that. Tom's presentation sort of wonderfully put that out. The idea that innovation is inherently disruptive. It has winners and it has losers. And what we've seen, what we're focused on here is the idea of inclusive innovation. And if we, there is a literature on inclusive innovation as a sort of national scale. And the idea of inclusive innovation has become this sort of significant buzzword in economic development. And so Nesta, the National Endowment for Science, Technology and the Arts, a UK endowment or a research group, research and sort of advocacy body, they did a review of innovation strategies across developed and developing countries. And I think they found that almost all of them have some form of reference to the social impact of innovation now. So this notion, this sort of fuzzily defined notion of inclusive innovation has become very, very important. But what I'm interested in is how this is being implemented and implemented at a city level, or a city or a regional level. Because it strikes me that, it's one thing for the National Innovation Strategy to have something about inclusive innovation. It's quite a different thing to take this sort of academic concept of inclusive innovation and apply it at a local or subnational level. But this is actually, often quite important, because these are places where, inequalities are often most stark. And I'll talk a little bit about the case of London. Sorry to be parochial, but the case of London, which I think is a really interesting example here. And I should say that what we do, this is a piece of work which is ongoing. We're doing our interviews at the moment. We've done our interviews for London. We haven't been able to speak to anyone in the US. So let me talk about inclusive innovation, the concept of inclusive innovation. So this is Google Trends searches for inclusive innovation over time, between 2006 right up until last week when I put this slide deck together. And essentially what we can see is that there has been a, this is Google Trends data. So it tells you that the higher the bar, the more people are searching worldwide for inclusive innovation. And you can see that right back in 2006, not really very much, a few sort of sporadic sort of searches. But after, basically in this decade, it has started to increase, or at least become more consistent in terms of people searching for it. Right up until, and it's sort of ebbing and flowing, but the sort of trend is that people are sort of interested in it. Now, this is not a sort of, it's not a fantastic upwards line. It's not one of us sort of, it's not one of sort of Tom's income inequality graphs. It's a sort of flatter graph, but I do have a sort of more unambiguous trend line. This is Scopus searches. This is academic papers with the term inclusive innovation in them. And one thing you can see here is that there has been a significant increase in the number of papers which are focused on this idea of inclusive innovation. So it's becoming a sort of bit of a policy agenda. And actually I became interested in it because, I wrote a paper, sort of well-received paper about inclusive growth in the UK, probably sort of 3 years ago now. And part of the response to that paper was people sort of getting in touch and saying, oh, we don't actually care about inclusive growth that much, but what do you know about inclusive innovation? Of course, my answer was, well, not very much at all. Now, there is an academic literature on this. There's this literature on inclusive growth, lots of studies in the UK, people like Anne Green, sort of wonderful scholar at Birmingham doing work on this, Ruth Lupton, really sort of trying to make the point that there are sort of synergies between the idea of that you can grow the economy in a way which is sort of inclusive, or really trying to sort of interrogate that idea. But actually the literature is more developed in things like management studies. So Jerry George is a very well-cited paper from 2013. There's a handbook now on inclusive innovation. Not a single chapter in that handbook focuses on cities and regions, I don't think. Amos Zahavi and Dan Bresnitz have got a really nice paper in research policy on distribution sensitive innovation. Policy is much more concrete, much more focused out what they were going to do. And actually I spoke to them last week and they said they started looking at inclusive innovation but discovered it was sort of too nebulous to sort of work from. But the real literature here is from development studies. So development studies, inclusive innovation in the Global South, Richard Heeks at Manchester, Jan Chataway at UCL. These people have been doing some sort of really nice work, basically trying to look at the idea of inclusive innovation. Now, when they talk about inclusive innovation, they're talking about something with a relatively sort of specific meaning. And I'll come to that in a moment. So one of Jerry George's papers, they have the concept that inclusive innovation is innovation that benefits the disenfranchised. So this is a big definition, quite broad, purely about the sort of beneficiaries. OECD, in their work on inclusive innovation, Karen Palnoff does quite a lot of work there, has used the term inclusive innovation. They are sort of slightly different initiatives that directly serve the welfare of lower income and excluded groups. So starting to get a little bit more concrete. And then Nesta, this UK government endowment, inclusive innovation policies are directed towards ensuring that the benefits and risks of innovation are more equally shared. Policies which actively consider whose needs are met by innovation and how excluded social groups could be better served, etc., etc. And these are relatively tightly defined conceptualizations of inclusive innovation. You may not agree with them, but they are at least common definitions. So we wanted to see, or I wanted to see how this definition became operationalized in real life. But to do this, I had a very good RA who basically spent a while Googling and getting a big load of strategies which we thought we could look at around inclusive innovation. And I'll talk more about the sort of definitions we use there. And then once we had that, I read a few of them, but she read loads and loads and loads of stuff to try and work out what they meant by inclusive innovation. And I'll talk about the problems with that in a moment. And then we had a phase of interviews where we had interviews with policymakers, which is sort of work which is underway. And this is all work in progress. We still are sort of developing the list and so on. Now, the criteria for inclusion, by poor RA, that I mean poor because she had to spend a lot of time on Google, not poor because she wasn't very good. But we basically, she basically found strategies which had to be sort of trying to link innovation and inclusion in some sense. This is entirely unscientific. This is purely an art, not science. There is no text mining or machine learning, but we wanted them to be in advanced democracies, which again I put in, advanced democracies and the UK, subnational, and some sort of geographical diversity. We can't do some sort of sample, so we're aiming for a sort of geographical diversity, really. Now, here are a few examples. So the example we've looked into most is London. Now, London's really interesting, not just because I'm here and because it's going through a difficult phase, but London's interesting because the term inclusive innovation has been used at various scales of government here. And it's been used by various scales of government here in very different ways. So this is from the London industrial strategy, local industrial strategy. The second aim is to support inclusive innovation in London. Now, the focus on innovation here is purely around productivity growth. It's about productivity growth and innovation to drive productivity growth, particularly where solving challenges, benefiting Londoners, SMEs and parts of the cities that have not typically shared in the benefits of innovation. So I'll give you an idea of the type of thing which they've done. Part of the old Olympic Park has been designated an inclusive innovation incubator for disabled entrepreneurs. So that sort of policy at a sort of top down, this is at the sort of strategic level at London, but at a sort of local level, we also find that there are parts of London boroughs. London Borough of Camden, for example, has an inclusive innovation network, which looks very different. It's much more about doing something which is focused on inclusive innovation as public service delivery, much more classic sort of type of, the type of thing which local government you would hope would do anyway. In DC, this is a particularly interesting example here. They have an inclusive innovation fund. Now, the reason this is interesting is because it sort of reflects some of these sort of issues around, how you might say, it's a sort of Silicon Valley type approach where you have essentially a sort of, quasi VC type fund, which invests at growing businesses in opportunity areas of DC. Seems very interesting to me, but we haven't looked into it in too much detail yet, but it definitely seems like the sort of thing which is, it's borrowing from this sort of Silicon Valley model of innovation, which I think is sort of quite interesting. And it's doing something quite different to what was done under the term inclusive innovation in London. And perhaps the most defined and the sort of furthest forward is Pittsburgh Roadmap for Inclusive Innovation. This is a, they published it quite a long time ago now, I think 2016, and this set out 6 areas. So it's an inclusive innovation strategy which sets out 6 areas which they wanted to focus on so 6 areas which were sort of focal points for their action in terms of inclusive innovation. Now, the interesting thing here, right, is that first of all, these are not always what I would expect to see in an inclusive innovation strategy. Addressing the digital divide seems fine, but some of the stuff seems sort of a little bit odd. So one of the things they have under there, improving internal operations and capacity of the city, which clearly is a good thing to do. One of the things they have there is expanding the number of smart trash cans, which can send out alerts when full, making waste management more efficient and reducing litter and operational costs in business areas. Great, got no objections to that as a sort of policy at all. However, it does not feel like it is very close to the sort of inclusive innovation agenda, which we have seen in other, as comes out of the sort of academic literature. Another example here, right? One of the things they've suggested they're going to do is brand Pittsburgh an inclusive innovation city. So there's a sort of city branding element. And of course, as soon as, I studied with people like Ian Gordon at LSE, and as soon as I see city branding come into anything, I start to think a little bit more suspiciously about it. And I'm not saying that this isn't, there's not lots of good stuff in there, but the key point here is that, the contact, if you take the nice academic concept, it clearly doesn't apply, clearly doesn't sort of survive contact with reality, and particularly in this case, contact with the powers which Pittsburgh's policymakers seem to have. So what I'm doing in this paper is critiquing this notion of inclusive innovation as it is operationalized. And I'm doing this on sort of, three main critiques. The first one is this critique of fuzziness. So it seems this is a Rorschach test. Rorschach test, you see in it whatever your sort of preconceived idea is, so you'll see a something which is at the back of your sort of latent subconsciousness. Now, there's something similar here with the sort of fuzzy conceptualizations of inclusive innovation. Certainly the policymakers we spoke to in London, they had this sort of notion of inclusive innovation. They knew it was a sort of relatively fashionable term, and they were going to use it to mean whatever they wanted it to mean. And actually, this goes back to Markinson's work, where researchers may believe they're addressing the same phenomenon, but may actually be targeting quite different ones. And it's a sort of, I think a similar conceptualization to this. So you can see inclusive innovation as a sort of classic fuzzy concept in that sense. So we've got 10 different definitions of inclusive innovation, which we find in the literature, which we've looked at so far. So inclusive decision-making. So the classic definition for inclusive innovation, people will sort of refer to the Tata Nano car in India. So this is number 6 here. So I'm calling it an inclusive innovation here. And that's really the sort of focus on what is produced. But actually, there's a lot of other sort of ways of understanding inclusive innovation as part of which are underneath this sort of fuzzy conceptualization. So there's stuff about inclusive innovation making for innovation in inclusive sectors, geographically diversifying innovation, type of stuff which we sort of think about a lot. Some of this stuff is around outcomes, some of it is around participation, and some of it's strategy. Now I need to be careful here, right? Because a lot of this stuff I think is really, really important. So, particularly the stuff around inclusivity and entrepreneurship, inclusivity in STEM, this is hugely important. And, there's a lot of, frankly, overdue policy in this area trying to diversify the innovation workforce of London, for example. That's really, really important. I'm not trying to sort of, have a problem with that. I think there are problems when it is, I think there are problems with other parts of the inclusive innovation agenda and the way that it is sort of framed by local and subnational policymakers. Now, to do this, I reflect back on the literature on buzzwords. There's a wonderful paper by Cornwell and Brock from 2005 where they look at the merits or otherwise of buzzwords in economic development, and inclusive innovation certainly seems to have become something of a buzzword, certainly amongst the policymakers we've talked to. Now, they always put up a sort of defense, and they say, actually, we're using the term inclusive innovation because it's very hard to oppose. I mean, no one wants to be seen as anti-inclusive, and innovation is seen as a good thing. So for many of the people I spoke to, actually, they're saying inclusive innovation is a good thing because it is fuzzy. This fuzziness allows us to do things which we wouldn't otherwise be able to do. But I think there are some sort of problems with it. This clarity of definition inhibits learning. It keeps people honest in terms of what policymakers are doing, and it focuses policy agendas. So I think there's a danger that it becomes a sort of buzzword, which is sort of easily dismissed, even though I think hidden in this sort of inclusive innovation agenda are some really important policies. My second critique is about powers. So the Pittsburgh examples, I think, are a really good example here of the problems we have when you have a concept and it sort of meets reality, because inclusive innovation, like I say, it sounds great. If you're a policymaker, it sounds like a really, hard to oppose concept. And actually one of the things which we can see is sort of progressive officials, who have powers over innovation or have some powers over innovation, not much powers over other things around sort of distribution. Certainly in the UK, it becomes a sort of fashionable, hard to oppose, almost a sort of Trojan horse to get new policies, policies which are progressive to get them to happen when they can. But the problem is that actually, often they don't match the powers of local government. So you end up with this stuff like inclusive innovation strategies, which have, sort of bizarre policies around bins smuggled into them. And all of this, this problematic sprawl makes it harder it makes oversight harder, it makes learning harder, and it makes it harder to hold policymakers to account. My final critique is, I think, well, certainly my favorite, and I think it's the most important one, really. And that is, it's in some senses, it's a form of creative distraction, if you might sort of pardon the pun. And the reason is that we know that there is a long history of studies which show that people rely on technology often as easy solutions to complex social problems. So Morozov, right back in 2013, which is a great book on solutionism, the idea that new technology is often seen as a solution to difficult social problems. In the UK, this is one of the problems we often have with government policy. We see it for Brexit, people talking about new technologies which might make transfer across the Northern Irish border easier, or new technologies which can somehow solve the problems we face in the coronavirus. You have this tendency to see new technology as providing a solution. I do this myself. Every time I get a new laptop, I think I'm going to be the most productive academic in history. And of course, it never happens because it's just solutionism. And the second sort of concept I think is important here is this notion of neophilia. And Tom Scott-Smith, friend of mine at Oxford, he has a wonderful paper where he sort of traces neophilia, the use of technology in the aid process. And he basically shows that well-meaning actors are drawn to these sort of shiny new fixes for complex problems. So, why would you provide people with a sort of ordinary nutrition when you use from sort of something as old-fashioned as vegetables, when you could provide them with a pill or a paste or something like that? He's got a wonderful book out on talking about humanitarian neophilia, and you can see similar things, I think, in some of the inclusive innovation material we're talking about. Because one of the things we know about urban and regional inequality is that it is complex. It's often the product of global economic trends as much as it is the product of sort of local issues. And it is often, particularly somewhere like the UK, due to problems in the welfare state, not innovation. That's not necessarily the problem. It's about issues of sort of entrenched racism rather than rather than being due to sort of, inavailability of laptops. So I'm not saying that it's useless. I'm just saying that there's a problem that, if we use it, if it distracts us too much from these wider political causes of these problems. Now, I just kind of want to conclude by just sort of saying that actually what I don't mean to say is that inclusive innovation is worthless in some sense. I mean, this is a sympathetic critique, and I think there's a lot of hugely important work happening under the sort of remit of inclusive innovation. First of all, there's this wonderful stuff about addressing the barriers to inclusion at a local level. I think there's a really strong local level justification for, having some sort of, some local policies focused on getting disadvantaged groups, particularly into the innovation economy. There's issues, some of the things we saw actually more rhetorical than sort of policy was the idea that you need to deal with the localized consequences of innovation, particularly, I guess Frederick's paper brings this out very clearly to me, the idea that sort of innovation in one place can have a significant impact somewhere else. And actually, dealing with the localized consequences of innovation, I think there's a strong argument for having that as part of these sort of inclusive innovation strategies. And look, while I worry a lot about the fact that inclusive innovation is a sort of, it's a buzzword. It's sort of, slightly nebulous. People sort of kind of know roughly what you're talking about, but actually mean entirely different things. These features which make it politically acceptable, at least there is something happening here. And actually one of the things, which came out of our interviews with policymakers is that, they may not love this concept, but it is better than having nothing which focuses on distribution. It does at least provide some sort of fashionable way of smuggling in some of these really important policies, which might otherwise sort of not necessarily be thought about. So just to conclude, I just wanted to draw back to the sort of regional innovation policy literature. And one of the things we know from people like Phil McCann, Tego Aguiles, the sort of review of the literature they did right back in 2013 was that we didn't tend to think very much about distribution when we talked about innovation policy. Maybe that's unfair, but it certainly wasn't as important as I think it should be. And actually, the inclusive innovation agenda certainly moves us a little bit towards that goal. But I do think we need to be very careful with it. First of all, it's a fuzzy concept. The sort of policy agendas, often which are sort of developed at a sort of national level, these are not always appropriate at a local level. And I think my favorite critique is this, problems of solutionism and neophilia. I mean, we know that inequality is too high. And actually, we know many of the reasons for that, and they're not to do with, availability of new technology and the type of things which are going to be solved in an inclusive innovation strategy. So I'll just leave it on the point that inclusive innovation is only ever going to get us so far. Inclusion is going to require some of these boring old policies as well. Thank you.
Thank you for the interesting presentation on inclusive innovation. I have several questions, but I first wanted to remind you that that you can post some questions in the system as well. But let me start with maybe a question to Frederick, because we have a very peculiar question, and I think he can answer it, because there's a new House Judiciary Subcommittee on Antitrust report, The question is what he thinks of these recommendations in this report from the subcommittee. Frederick, can you answer this? I think you have to unmute yourself. Frederick?
We seem to have, Frederick is just a blue screen for me. So let me jump in and say that right now there's a lot of attention on breaking up these monopolies. And what we see is that each one is very different. They have different business models. They follow different strategies. Yet, you know, I think that we're seeing they affect this concentration in the same way. And so we have seen now for the first time in really about 30 years, some consideration of antitrust and monopoly restraint, which is satisfying. And so we've been following this with, you know, sort of very eagerly. Frederick, are you back?
Okay, probably he's coming back, but maybe in between I take a question for Neil from the audience, from Nicola. Can you see it, or shall I read it to you?
I can see it, I can see it. So the question is, where would you put strategies that raise the contribution of blue-collar workers in innovation processes? And do we see any evidence from the city strategies that we've seen so far? So actually, most of the strategies we've looked at, it is about underrepresented groups in terms of, and it's traditionally minorities, actually. So there's some stuff in Belgium, you know, so it's I'd say that's the sort of overarching focus. There's been less on the sort of, the sort of, if I may say, the sort of class-based type of stuff, which is interesting in itself, right? It's interesting in itself. And I'm not saying that that's a sort of, necessarily the wrong focus, but I do think that this is one of the things which has been sort of, missing in some of these strategies. See, in the UK, the Welsh government's doing some stuff here, but the problem is, the problem we have in places like the UK, of course, is that the sort of, many of the, should we say, the blue collar workers are not always in the places which are the sort of innovation hubs, whereas in places like London, the sort of classic problem is much more, first, second generation migrants who are not sort of not as well integrated into the labour market as potentially they could be. But I'm very interested to see what your presentation tomorrow, says on this actually.
Thank you. Now Frederick is back. Do you want to add to Maryann's comment on the report?
Sure. Yeah. This is. This question is regarding the recently completed investigation of competition in digital markets by the subcommittee on antitrust, commercial and administrative law, whatever, in the House of Representatives. So they had dramatic hearings in which they brought CEOs of big tech companies to talk to them, and they have a number of recommendations. And I think to me, the most interesting part of the there are a couple of interesting parts of the recommendations. One, the most obvious is simply restoring American antitrust, which is to say anti-monopoly policy, because these laws, the laws restricting monopoly, which in the United States go back to the early 1900s, were reinterpreted in the 1980s in a way that made them much less effective. And I basically introduced this doctrine that you had to prove that consumers had been harmed. Well, before that, you just had to prove that competition was being restricted, right? So now, under the current circumstances, if you drive all the competitors out of business, or in the case of Amazon, set up a system where you can actually rake in their business as your own or charge them for using your business, it's not a problem if it looks like you're creating lower prices than what otherwise exist. The other thing, I think the main thing that I'm very glad to see is that they're not talking about breaking up these platform systems. They're talking more about equal access, sort of a level playing field of access to use of the systems. You read a lot, people will often by reflex when looking at a monopoly talk about breaking it up, but you break up a network. I mean, networks, their value is in the fact that they are big. Their value is in the fact that they serve many people and connect them. So you can't break that up. You have to, and I think the House recognizes this very well, create a situation in which the gatekeepers of that network are not able to leverage their position to discriminate against different players in the network and accumulate a lot of rents in that sense. I think if their recommendations were followed vigorously, it would have a big effect on the inclusiveness of innovation. To go to Neil's point, because it would allow more players into the market, and would likely have a geographical effect in that it would allow those players. It would reduce the benefit of those players of being centrally located right next to the big firm, in hope of being taken over. Rather, they could locate somewhere else. I mean, this is, technologically speaking, a footloose enterprise, right? I mean, you're connected by the web. You should be able to do business anywhere, right? And if the kinds of remedies they're talking about with access to this system being opened up, I think would do a lot for that.
Okay. I have one question to Frederick, which comes to my mind, but maybe to Neil first, because if you have a look on regional inequality between regions or within regions, and link this to inclusive innovation, what do you think is the impact of inclusive innovation or policy for inclusive innovation? Is it possible to deal with within region inequality or between region inequality? What would work in your
Well, I mean, so the term inclusive innovation is used to mean both of these forms of policy, right? So sometimes we'll see inclusive innovation as being sort of referred to as, used as a way of sort of saying we need more innovation in the sort of peripheral or the sort of lagging regions. I mean, that's kind of the problem with the concept. It's so sort of, nebulous that sort of stuff ends up being, considered as part of inclusive innovation, which is, I guess, fine for us because we're all interested in that. So, I mean, that's what I'd sort of say. I mean, it's quite hard to say what, can I take Torben's question quickly as well, if that's all right? Because Torben's got a question on the thing about is there any data regarding inclusive innovation projects? And the answer is not, as far as I know. I mean, one of the things we're planning on doing, next actually is that, in several countries, they do make innovation data, so they do have information which is sort of, openly available on innovation grants. And actually, we're going to start looking at that and look at the sort of, potential inclusivity of that. Obviously, this appeals to me because suddenly we can do something which is a little bit more complicated, sort of econometrically. And also, we're sort of fishing in the dark a little bit less. And in terms of the sort of role of the government, and which is Torben's other, well, one of Torben's other questions, we're basically interested in how subnational government are, or I'm interested in how subnational government is sort of enacting this, because it strikes me that national government does have powers which can do some sort of interesting things around inclusive innovation. They can shape the R&D budget to focus on care workers, or they can legislate at a national level to sort of try and do something which is important about so I think there's some sort of important national government points. Part of the point of the paper is that actually it's the subnational government just doesn't have the powers to do stuff which is which would be seen as sort of classic inclusive innovation.
There's another question in the system asking on policy learning and policy diffusion, and whether there are advocates for the concept of inclusive innovation. Maybe you can answer to this.
Yeah, so this is a really important question, and I should have mentioned it probably if I'd had another slide, because but part of the reason I didn't was because we're sort of, it's a little bit controversial. But so clearly, so initially I kind of thought this was going to be an example of fast policy, people taking policy in one place and just applying it somewhere else because it's sort of fashionable. I don't think that's quite the case, because people are sort of doing different things everywhere. So it's not quite enough. I can't really sort of say as being fast policy, because they're not necessarily even learning from other people. They're sort of, taking the sort of basic concept and applying it in quite different ways. But then in terms of organizational bodies which are sort of funding this agenda, so the OECD has done some good work on sort of inclusive innovation, not necessarily inclusive innovation on cities, but there is something which we're sort of focusing on at the moment, and don't tweet this, but it's consultancies. So one of the things we saw in London was the sort of, the first people we were asked to speak to was, at the end of when we interview people, we say, who else should we speak to? And they'll always say, oh, this consultancy, they've been sort of telling us to do inclusive innovation stuff. So I think that's something which we'll definitely be following up, because it's a great point. Okay,
thank you. Frederick, coming back to you and what you just said in the end, because that was coming to my mind. I'm living in a small village in a rural area, and your recommendation was move to the big city. And probably this was true when the production or the employees had to be close to the production, because it was industrial manufacturing work. But especially all those monopolies you just mentioned are located in a peculiar region mostly, but their workers might be located somewhere on the world or somewhere in the country. So what's the link of agglomeration and monopoly? And on the other hand, digitalization in Corona home office work. So isn't there the possibility that agglomeration economies and at least the wages of the workers are more spread geographically than the profit of the firms?
Well, obviously we have to see what the lasting effect of these coronavirus changes will be. The argument gets made that this is teaching us how to work in this way, right? And maybe we'll never get on a plane to go to a conference again. We'll just have conferences like this. If it does that, it would be reversing a tide which we've seen now for decades. Which is roughly that these technologies that we think of as obliterating space have made it possible to relocate routine work outside of the big cities within any value chain, thereby, this is not, this is nothing new to me. I'm just, I'm sure everybody here is familiar with these arguments. Thereby allowing a greater and greater concentration of this creative work within the cities. This is the standard argument for this sort of creative agglomeration economies. And we in our paper we say yes, and that's augmented greatly by this market power in both the product markets and then in the financial markets that fund them. But certainly we see it in the map. You could say that, well, okay, Google's employees could be located anywhere in the country because they can telecommute. But those high-paid jobs are located, in certain places, and in particularly in the San Francisco Bay Area, right? So some of them telecommute, most of them seem not to. Also, for the smaller companies, they have a reason to be there. The financing arrangements are face arrangements. They want to. So I'm not the question of whether all of this telecommuting will allow the jobs that involve power and the jobs that involve a lot of creative work to be displaced at a higher rate than the routine jobs. I hope so. I'm not convinced. I'm not convinced it'll happen. Yeah, I hope you're right.
Okay, thank you. Time is more or less up. So if there's no further urgent question, I would like to thank the two presenters and all the participants asking questions. Many thanks. We will have a 30-minute break now. So we'll meet again at past whatever time Zoom you're in. And then we come to our last session, interesting combination. So we have one perspective from the United States and one from Europe, one on higher education and one on green technologies from Emily Rosenmann and Philip Kerner. So looking forward to see you again in 30 minutes, have a coffee break or have fun at least in the next time and relax a little bit for the last session. See you, bye-bye.